I'm here today with Michael Rotondi, principal of Roto Architects in Los Angeles and former director of SCI-Arc. Michael, thanks for joining me today. You became the director at SCI-Arc in 1987. The school had been under the direction of Ray Cappy. Graduated in the first class in 1973. I think that moment where you took over, the 80s in general, was a time when Los Angeles architecture started to shift. And it was offices like Morphosis and Studio Works and people like you and Tom Main, Craig Hodgetts and Robert Mangurian and Eric Moss and Coy Howard. I think a huge part of orchestrating that shift from import to export, that LA began to really generate ideas and began to be noticed in the global architectural culture in a certain way. And SCI-Arc, I think, was very much at the center.
Now, the things that we'll talk about, it's being in a reflective mode. When you're young, you don't have enough prior experience and memory to be reflective, so you're basically projective. And I think that's really what the school was at that time. There was a long period between Frank Lloyd Wright coming here and then attracting Schindler, Neutra, and then Lautner, and Harwell Hamilton Harris, and Gregory Ain, and all of them. Incidentally, that's the neighborhood I grew up in. I think we became more aware of what Los Angeles meant in the context of the United States and the world. We were more aware of who we were. We were working on ourselves personally, we were working on our projects, we were working on the school, and we were working on the city all at the same time. And it was like it was all coming of age at the same time. The one thing that I often thought about, which was to the benefit of our generation, was the time in between that first generation. There was a critical mass of really great architects here. And then there was a space in between them and us, with the exception of a few people like Carl Maston and Ray Cappy and the like. There wasn't really a critical mass for that next generation. Esther McCoy thought it was Los Angeles real estate started to pop.
But so by the first generation, you mean people like Neutra, Schindler, the kind of modernism.
The modernism.
Pre-war, interwar modernism.
But they still brought with them, with the exception of Wright, say a language that became part of, it was part of the curriculum as well. We resisted that because we started to see the Europeans that were more expressive. Sharoon, Sterling, Alto. And it wasn't that we wanted to copy their architecture. What we wanted to do was copy their behavior.
I see.
And what became evident to me was that the umbilical cord from Europe never made it over the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
And that was why we could do mix and match with just about anything we wanted to. It was quite eclectic, because we didn't have to inherit anything. We could actually invent a life.
Right.
And not be expected to inherit. It started at a time where there was enough distance between all of the student revolutions of the 60s, and then the civil unrest started in the mid-60s. Something positive had to be done. So SCI-Arc, I've always felt, was sort of reaction, but then that reaction was flipped over. I always saw SCI-Arc as a love child, actually. It was not born out of anger, it was born out of joy. And I think that's actually part of its DNA right now. With that joy, it gives you the confidence to act in a more free way and not be worried about all of the eyes being on you.
When you took over as the director, it was a teenager.
The parallels between the age of an institution and the age of an individual and the age of, et cetera. The school was young and I was young. When Ray Cappy said, "I want you to be the next director," and I was shocked because I always thought Tom and Eric were the next in line. I always hung out with older brothers, and the older brothers are the ones that would run interference for the younger brother, so the younger brother could do what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And never thought that I would have to assume the responsibility for the family. Ray and Eric and Tom all concurred that the school needed somebody that could take a middle ground. It was a period also when we were coming of age professionally, making friendships around the world. And it was evident to me that Ray had some insight into taking this place from a local and regional place with some national reputation, international. And so that's really what the charge was.
For you to internationalize it.
Yeah, internationalize it in whatever that meant at the time. But it was basically just inviting all your friends to come here and teach, and then creating the conditions for them to have more fun than they have in their home institutions, and to produce work with students that they would then go back to wherever they were from, saying that there's this place that has amazing students and amazing colleagues, and there's a lot of experimental stuff going on.
There had been a kind of history of international outreach at the school. I mean, so by that time, Vico had long been established in Switzerland.
We started Vico, actually, Vico started in the 80s. That was an outreach.
And there was Moscow in 87, 88,
Moscow was 1988. Moscow wanted to have an exchange program. They were visiting Ivy League schools, And then they decided they would come here. We were in our first facility, which was
on
Berkeley, Nebraska. Large group coming from Moscow show up. There's about 15 of them. The head of the Union of Architects, which was a powerful position. It was the head of the School of Architecture, extraordinary professor who had taught what eventually became known as the paper architects, because they weren't doing buildings at that time. And walking around SCI-Arc, what they saw in the building that sort of peeling apart was an immense amount of work being done. And they said, would you like to have an exchange program with the University of Moscow? And it was 1988, and the school was still in its sort of reconceptualizing phase. I said, well, why? Because you could have chosen Harvard, Princeton, Yale, any of those. They said that if the constructivists had started a school, it would have been this. And I said, cool, okay, let's go for it. Yeah. One of the first phone calls that I made was to Peter Cook. Peter Cook was in orbit at the school since the very beginning because he was friends with Ray. Peter would come into town for 2 weeks. We actually would shut down the school in the slow period of the spring semester. And it was intentional. And then we'd...
Oh, so he'd bring him in during the doldrums?
I said, okay, the school is all yours, Peter. And he would set up all of these different kind of workshops going on and just energize the place. It became like a 12-ring circus.
Yeah.
And a lot of things were done, a lot of energy, a lot of fun. So the school kind of, it built like that. Wolf Prix was one of the first international faculty that we invited. So Wolf came and started teaching here on a regular basis.
You were simultaneously working on the school, the city, and your practices, because at that time, I think Wolf was doing the project in Malibu and then did the house in Venice.
I would make pilgrimages when I would travel to see all of Sterling's work or all of Alto's work. At this time, I'd seen there was one book that, black and white, that Kopelmo Blau put out. Tom and I immediately fell in love with the work. I'm in Berlin. I asked if I could meet Wolf and Helmut, and so I go to Vienna and see them and visit all of their work.
Yeah.
And in the context of Vienna, the work made a lot of sense because Vienna is tight, and then this stuff is basically breaking out. And it's really powerful, especially when you go to Vienna for the first time. In Los Angeles, there's nothing to break out of, so it's just all going like this.
It makes perfect sense to me that somebody like Peter and somebody like Wolf would find it so comfortable here. And then SCI-Arc becomes a kind of crucible for that sort of traffic.
Everything was trial and error here. What we discovered at that time also was a relationship between structure and freedom. In order to have freedom, you had to have some kind of structure. Now there's a lot more structure, and the struggle is how to keep the freedom.
One of the important achievements of your time as director was that the school did kind of grow up administratively. That was when things like accreditation started being taken more seriously.
Anarchists did not want structure. There were no assigned studio spaces. First, there was no curriculum. For the first 5 years, there was no curriculum. It was open enrollment for 15 years, pretty much. Coming of age in Los Angeles, you became exceptionally good and ultimately an expert at doing things for the first time. So we did this. I did the same thing with the graduate students, formed a graduate program, and then took them to at least more space and moved them into an adjacent warehouse building. That created a furor that they had their own space instead of being mixed up. That I began the admissions in the school because I didn't want to spend time talking to somebody and then 2 weeks later they decide they want to start another career someplace.
Yeah.
I needed people that were vested in order to teach. It was important that the artistic director have full authority in the school. It was clear to me at that time that architecture, even though we didn't say it, there was a possibility that architecture be seen as a platform rather than it was just barely becoming a discipline.
Yeah.
It was a profession. And then because of the whites in New York, in particular Peter Eisenman, he brought like smart into architecture again.
Your generation of SCI-Arc faculty, you were really disciplinarians. Wouldn't have called yourselves that at the time. You probably wouldn't call yourself that now. I do think that shift from a kind of professional mold and mindset to a more disciplinary attitude was really what was taking place at the school and also in LA architecture. And it's funny to hear you to really kind of specify the institutional structure of the Institute at exactly the moment the architectural output was, I would say, getting quite a bit more experimental. One of the things I always find interesting about looking back at the kind of earlier work from the early years of SCI-Arc is a lot of it is pretty straightforward.
It's always a task of an institution, but also of teachers, to try to draw the creativity out. We were taking the ideas that we were pursuing in our offices and bringing them to school. The one thing that over that superseded everything was the experimental nature of our view on life, our view on architecture, our view on the school, on what a school should be. It had to work. We were subject to gravity, either literal gravity or figurative gravity.
With the graduate program coming in, did that increase the size of the school, or did that shift the...
Yeah, well, what it is, it brought a lot more women into the school. In the graduate program, when I started interviewing, I started noticing that there was a lot of women applying to the school. And they had already had at least one, if not two, other careers that they were working on. But they had all been discouraged from going into architecture. The first graduate class was 50-50. It was a good period for the graduate program, for sure. When I became the director, I decided I was going to make a trip. I went to see John Haydock, and he was very open and wonderful. It was the first time I'd met him. I went to see Werner Seligman because I wanted to see how you get rigor into a school and spend a couple of days with him. And then I went to see Alvin Boyarsky. From John, you just start to understand the poetry of education. And Seligman, it had to do with how to broaden a curriculum and narrow down the number of classes. Because what I was starting to see is that every subject, somebody inhales and exhales, it becomes a subject, and then it becomes a class, then it becomes a department, then it becomes a major, then it becomes, et cetera.
That's really interesting. I mean, so Syracuse, the Cooper Union, and the AA become the kind of
And then
models.
Alvin was, with all of the wonderful things he did, he was basically old school. He would set up competition where people would like butt heads, and then may the best man win. I came from a family where you understand that cooperation is biological necessity and an evolutionary imperative. Everything is shared.
Yeah.
You don't just share the margin, you share the principle. So the question was, can a creative institution exist without competition and pure cooperation? And finally, what came to mind is that it couldn't. But you didn't have to compete against each other. You can compete against a standard, and then you cooperate with each other. And then we started to think, how do you institutionalize that? You institutionalize that by making presentation spaces the space that everybody has to walk through.
It's now 2017, 20 years have passed since you stepped down as director. You remain, I would say, a very influential voice within the school. What are your thoughts on where the place is today?
Then and now. Things have changed and nothing has changed. I think the DNA of the school is still the DNA of the school. Getting a little emotional. It's hard in words to say the profound joy that I feel. Seeing a place still here, for one. And seeing the place grow beyond not only expectations. I can't say grow beyond expectations because I couldn't have even imagined doing what some of the things that Eric did. Well, Eric, I could have imagined doing some of those things, and I could have, and I often told him, don't do some of those things.
That's also part of this place.
That's part of this place. My life started changing when I became the director, and then I fell in romantic love, and then I fell into compassion in that order. Meeting my current wife, and then meeting the Dalai Lama, and then I started to come to terms with what defined me was my place of work and the school. And I decided that I had to work on becoming selfless. Part of that was letting go of feeling that I had to take responsibility for anything in the school other than teaching. It evolved into being filled with pride, seeing whoever was in charge. Neil takes it to another place, bringing in different teachers that I didn't bring in. We tried to digitize the school, but it was like with Commodore 64s. And then seeing Eric take it into the stratosphere. And then Hernan. It's like seeing the family not only succeeds, but becomes one of the defining institutions that others want to emulate in some way. The one thing that has always occurred from the time of Ray still till Hernan was understanding that SCI-Arc is a source, not the source, but it is a source. And so you find every way possible to bring people from all over the world here to see what's possible. And then once they see what's possible, you're not proprietary about it. You say, this is open source. Take it back to wherever you're coming from and make the world better. Ray instilled in me, we're here for some greater purpose. What it is, we can never be sure. The school's role in the world of architecture, but also in academia, which I think right now the school is leveling up big time. It's been leveling up with your presence here, and it's leveling up once again with the post-grad program. It's becoming a total ecosystem of intelligence and talent and technique. There's no way that any of us, especially me, could have known that the school would still be here and operating in such a profound way in terms of how it impacts the world. All of the students that I meet have the same character, the same motivation, and the same big heart that they had ever since the beginning. It still attracts extraordinary people to teach and as students here. I'll probably, I'll definitely go to my grave believing in my heart of hearts that anything imaginable is possible. And
I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. Thanks so much, Michael. This has been really great. And thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time on the SCI-Arc channel. Es que dejamos las cosas que tenéis que tener, porque eso me